They tried to break him with fines, but instead he broke their control. One swing of a gate, and suddenly the hunters found themselves trapped like cattle, paying to pass through his land. I stood at my property line watching Kenneth Martinez, our HOA president, pace back and forth like a caged animal behind the brand-new cattle gate I'd installed overnight. His face was redder than my prize bull's nose ring, and steam practically poured from his ears as he realized what I'd done. The massive steel gate stretched across the only road leading to the exclusive Meadowbrook Estate subdivision, and every single homeowner would have to pay the toll I'd posted on the sign. Private ranch access. $50 per vehicle. Kenneth's BMW sat idling behind the gate, along with a growing line of luxury cars filled with furious neighbors trying to get to their million-dollar homes. What Kenneth didn't know was that this was just the beginning of his nightmare, and I had been planning this moment for 6 months. The same man who had fined me $500 for keeping livestock on my residential property was about to learn that I owned something he never bothered to research: the private easement road that served as the only entrance to his precious subdivision. My neighbor Dave Wilson pulled up in his Tesla, rolled down his window, and shouted, "Marcus, what's this about? Kenneth's having a meltdown over there." I walked over calmly, my boots crunching on a gravel road that legally belonged to me, and handed Dave a laminated copy of the county property records. "Just exercising my property rights, Dave. This road belongs to my ranch. Always has. If Kenneth wants to treat this like farm country with his livestock violations, then we're going to operate like farm country." Dave's jaw dropped as he read the official documents, showing that the road easement had reverted back to my family's original ranch property due to a technicality Kenneth's precious HOA had overlooked. Kenneth was now screaming into his phone, probably calling his lawyer, but I knew something he didn't. His lawyer was about to deliver some very bad news about property law and easement rights. The irony was delicious. For 2 years, Kenneth had made my life miserable with constant citations, fines, and threats over my small cattle operation that had been grandfathered in long before his subdivision existed. He'd organized the HOA board to vote on new restrictions specifically targeting my property, hired inspectors to harass me weekly, and even tried to get the county to condemn my land for incompatible use. Now, every morning commute would require his neighbors to pay tribute to the very ranch operation he'd tried so hard to destroy. I pulled out my phone and started recording as Kenneth's face turned an even deeper shade of purple. "You can't do this, Marcus. This is illegal. I'm calling the sheriff," he screamed across the fence. I smiled and waved, knowing that the sheriff was an old family friend who had already reviewed my legal rights and given me the green light for my toll operation. The beauty of my revenge was that it was completely legal and absolutely unstoppable. The original property deed from 1952 clearly stated that the road easement would revert to the ranch property if the HOA ever violated the agricultural use agreement, which they had done by passing ordinances prohibiting livestock. Kenneth's own anti-cattle crusade had triggered the very clause that gave me control over their only access road. As I watched the line of cars growing longer, I knew that Kenneth had no idea how much worse things were about to get for him. This toll gate was just phase one of a master plan that would expose every dirty secret he'd been hiding behind his HOA presidency. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they were untouchable? Let me know in the comments, because Kenneth Martinez was about to learn that some fights you should never pick. Kenneth Martinez ruled the Meadowbrook Estates HOA like a medieval tyrant who had discovered suburban property codes. At 52 years old, this former middle manager had found his calling in the petty tyranny of homeowner associations, wielding his clipboard and measuring tape like weapons of mass destruction. He lived in the subdivision's largest house, a gaudy McMansion with more marble columns than the Lincoln Memorial, and treated every HOA meeting like his personal courtroom, where he served as judge, jury, and executioner. Kenneth had run unopened for HOA president for 3 consecutive terms, not because people liked him, but because everyone was too intimidated to challenge his iron-fisted rule. His daily routine involved patrolling the neighborhood in his white BMW, looking for violations with the dedication of a detective hunting serial killers. The man had turned HOA enforcement into an art form of psychological warfare. Kenneth kept detailed files on every resident, complete with photographs of violations, timestamps of infractions, and personal notes about each homeowner's compliance attitude. He had installed security cameras throughout the neighborhood under the guise of community safety, but everyone knew he used them to spy on residents and document potential violations. His favorite targets were working families who couldn't afford to fight his fines, elderly residents who struggled with yard maintenance, and anyone who dared to question his authority at board meetings. Kenneth had perfected the art of selective enforcement. His friends got warnings while his enemies got maximum penalties and legal threats. What made Kenneth particularly dangerous was his alliance with his cronies on the HOA board. Robert Chun, a nervous accountant who rubber-stamped every fine Kenneth proposed. Patricia Thompson, his secretary who handled all correspondence with military precision. And James Rodriguez, a retired security guard who served as Kenneth's personal enforcer for property inspections. Together, they had transformed the once friendly neighborhood into a surveillance state where residents lived in fear of stepping out of line. Kenneth's power trip had grown so extreme that he had started fining people for violations that didn't even exist in the HOA bylaws, confident that most residents wouldn't spend thousands on legal fees to fight $200 fines. But Kenneth's biggest weakness was his massive ego and his complete inability to research anything beyond the surface level. He assumed that because my property sat adjacent to his subdivision, I must be subject to his HOA rules despite never signing any agreements or paying any dues. He had declared war on my cattle operation without bothering to investigate the complex property history that had been brewing a legal nightmare for his precious kingdom. Kenneth genuinely believed that his HOA presidency made him untouchable, that his connections with code enforcement and local contractors gave him unlimited power to destroy anyone who challenged him. He had no idea that his obsession with controlling my ranch would trigger a chain of events that would expose years of corruption, fraud, and abuse of power that he had carefully hidden behind his clipboard and his fake smile. Kenneth's harassment campaign against me had started small, a few complaints about agricultural odors and inappropriate land use, but had escalated into a full-scale assault on my property rights. He had organized his board to pass new restrictions every month, each one clearly designed to target my operation and force me to sell my land to his developer friends. What Kenneth didn't realize was that every illegal action he took, every fraudulent fine he issued, and every corrupt deal he made was being carefully documented by someone who understood exactly how to destroy a petty tyrant's empire from the inside out. The breaking point came on a scorching Tuesday morning in August when I discovered Kenneth had made the biggest mistake of his pathetic little reign. He had illegally cut the water line to my cattle troughs, leaving my animals without access to fresh water in 95-degree heat. I found him standing at my property fence with a smug grin, wearing his ridiculous HOA president polo shirt, holding a citation for maintaining a public nuisance, while my bulls desperately licked at the empty concrete troughs. "Those animals are a health hazard to our community, Marcus," he declared with the confidence of someone who thought he was above the law. The county health department agrees that livestock operations have no place in residential areas. What Kenneth didn't know was that tampering with livestock water supplies wasn't just an HOA violation. It was a felony under Texas agricultural protection laws, and I had security cameras documenting his entire crime spree. But Kenneth's water sabotage was just the beginning of his criminal rampage. Over the next week, I discovered that he had been running a systematic corruption scheme that made his harassment of my ranch look like child's play. Kenneth had been taking bribes from contractors to approve shoddy construction projects that violated county building codes, skimming money from the HOA's reserve funds to pay for his personal legal battles, and falsifying inspection reports to help his developer friends rush through subdivision expansions. The man had turned the Meadowbrook Estates HOA into his personal criminal enterprise, and his attack on my ranch had been motivated by a secret deal he'd made to sell my land to the same developers who had been padding his bank account. The scope of Kenneth's corruption was staggering. I found evidence that he had been forging signatures on HOA documents, manipulating election results to stay in power, and using his position to intimidate residents into selling their homes below market value to his business partners. Kenneth had created a paper trail of fraud that stretched back 3 years, including falsified financial reports, inflated contractor bills that lined his pockets, and illegal assessments that violated state HOA regulations. His water sabotage of my ranch wasn't just petty revenge. It was part of a larger scheme to force me off my land so his developer cronies could build luxury condos on property that had been in my family for generations. What made Kenneth's mistake even more catastrophic was the timing. His attack on my cattle operation coincided with a state investigation into HOA corruption that had been triggered by complaints from residents across the county. Kenneth's illegal actions had attracted the attention of the Texas Attorney General's office, the county sheriff's department, and the state agricultural commission, all agencies that took livestock welfare and property rights very seriously. By sabotaging my ranch, Kenneth had handed me the perfect opportunity to expose his entire criminal operation while simultaneously destroying his credibility with the very authorities he thought he controlled. The beautiful irony of Kenneth's fatal mistake was that he had always used water as a weapon against other residents, cutting off irrigation to force lawn violation fines, reporting neighbors for excessive sprinkler use, and manipulating utility access to punish anyone who crossed him. Now his own illegal water sabotage had created a criminal case that would unravel every corrupt deal he'd ever made and expose the depth of his abuse of power. Kenneth thought he was teaching me a lesson about respecting HOA authority, but he had actually handed me the keys to his kingdom and the evidence I needed to destroy everything he had built through lies, fraud, and intimidation. While Kenneth celebrated his water sabotage victory with his cronies at the country club, I was quietly building a legal case that would have made a federal prosecutor jealous. My secret weapon wasn't just my knowledge of property law or my family's ranching history. It was my background as a former military intelligence analyst who knew exactly how to document corruption and build airtight cases against criminals who thought they were untouchable. For 6 months, I had been systematically gathering evidence of Kenneth's crimes, using surveillance techniques I'd learned overseas to track his financial dealings, record his illegal activities, and map out his entire network of corrupt contractors and complicit officials. My home office had been transformed into a war room filled with property records, financial documents, audio recordings, and video evidence of Kenneth's criminal enterprise. I had installed hidden cameras throughout my property that captured Kenneth's trespassing, vandalism, and water sabotage in high-definition detail. Every fraudulent fine he'd issued, every forged signature on HOA documents, and every bribery payment he'd received had been carefully documented and cross-referenced with bank records, contractor invoices, and witness statement from intimidated residents who were finally ready to speak up against their tyrannical HOA president. The depth of evidence I had gathered was staggering. Kenneth's corruption scheme involved a network of at least 12 contractors who had been overcharging the HOA for maintenance work and kicking back percentages to Kenneth's personal accounts. I had documented over $200,000 in fraudulent charges spanning 3 years, including invoices for work that was never performed, materials that were never delivered, and emergency repairs that were completely unnecessary. Kenneth had been using his HOA presidency as a personal ATM, and his attack on my ranch had given me the probable cause I needed to expose his entire criminal operation to state and federal authorities. But my most devastating evidence came from Kenneth's own electronic communications. Using techniques I'd mastered in military intelligence, I had gained access to Kenneth's email accounts, text messages, and financial records that revealed the full scope of his corruption. Kenneth had been sloppy with digital security, using the same passwords for multiple accounts and conducting criminal business through easily monitored communication channels. His emails contained detailed discussions of bribery schemes, plans to manipulate HOA elections, and explicit instructions to intimidate residents who challenged his authority, all evidence that would guarantee criminal convictions when presented to the right authorities. What Kenneth couldn't have known was that my military background had connected me with a network of federal agents, state investigators, and legal experts who specialized in public corruption cases. I had already briefed the FBI's white-collar crime unit about Kenneth's activities, provided preliminary evidence to the Texas Attorney General's office, and coordinated with the county sheriff's department to ensure that Kenneth's water sabotage would trigger a comprehensive investigation into his entire criminal enterprise. My toll gate wasn't just revenge. It was the opening move in a carefully orchestrated campaign that would systematically destroy every aspect of Kenneth's corrupt little kingdom, while ensuring that justice was served for every resident he had victimized over the years. The monthly HOA meeting on September 15th was supposed to be Kenneth's moment of triumph, his chance to publicly celebrate forcing the troublesome rancher to comply with subdivision standards and demonstrate his absolute power over property owners who dared to challenge his authority. Kenneth had packed the community center with his supporters, prepared a PowerPoint presentation about maintaining community values, and even brought a photographer to document his victory speech for the neighborhood newsletter. What he didn't expect was to find me sitting in the front row with a manila folder full of evidence and a laptop connected to the projection system, ready to turn his victory lap into the most devastating public humiliation in HOA history. Before we begin tonight's agenda, I announced, standing up as Kenneth called the meeting to order, I think the community deserves to know exactly what kind of man has been running their HOA for the past 3 years. Kenneth's face went white as I clicked the first slide, revealing bank records showing $47,000 in mysterious deposits to his personal account from contractors who had received no-bid HOA contracts. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as resident after resident recognized the inflated invoices for work that had never been completed on their properties. "This is highly irregular," Kenneth sputtered, reaching for his gavel. "You're out of order." But board member Robert Shun was already staring at the financial documents with growing horror, realizing that his rubber stamp approval of Kenneth's spending had made him an accessory to fraud. The evidence kept coming in devastating waves. Video footage of Kenneth cutting my water lines played on the big screen, followed by audio recordings of him accepting bribes from contractors and threatening residents who complained about HOA violations. Kenneth's carefully constructed image as a dedicated community leader crumbled as I presented 3 years' worth of forged signatures, manipulated election results, and falsified financial reports that had hidden over $200,000 in stolen HOA funds. "These are lies. Doctored evidence," Kenneth screamed, but his panic was obvious to everyone in the room as residents began shouting questions about their own mysterious fines and assessment increases. The final blow came when I revealed Kenneth's secret deal with Pinnacle Development Corporation, the same company that had been bribing him to approve substandard construction projects and manipulate residents into selling their homes below market value. Kenneth Martinez has been planning to force me off my ranch so Pinnacle could build luxury condos on agricultural land, I explained, showing emails where Kenneth discussed using HOA harassment to soften up property owners for forced sales. But what he didn't know was that his own illegal actions triggered the easement clause that gave me control over your only access road, and Pinnacle's development plans just became impossible to execute. The community center exploded in chaos as residents realized they had been victims of a systematic corruption scheme that had been stealing their money and manipulating their property values for years. Kenneth tried to flee the meeting, but county sheriff deputies were waiting outside with arrest warrants based on the evidence I had provided to state investigators. As Kenneth was led away in handcuffs, his cronies on the HOA board scrambled to distance themselves from his crimes. But it was too late. The entire corrupt organization was about to face a reckoning that would expose decades of abuse and fraud. The man who had thought himself untouchable was now facing federal charges that could put him in prison for the next 20 years. Kenneth's arrest at the HOA meeting was just the beginning of his spectacular downfall. Within 72 hours, his entire criminal empire collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. The FBI raid on his McMansion uncovered additional evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud that extended far beyond his HOA corruption, including offshore accounts containing over $500,000 in stolen funds and forged documents that implicated a network of contractors and developers in a multi-county bribery scheme. Kenneth's white BMW was impounded as evidence, his bank accounts were frozen by federal marshals, and his precious mansion was seized under asset forfeiture laws as the proceeds of criminal activity. The man who had spent years terrorizing neighbors with petty fines now faced federal charges that carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison and millions in restitution payments. The local media coverage of Kenneth's arrest was absolutely brutal. Channel 7 News ran a week-long series called HOA Horror Stories that featured interviews with dozens of residents who had been victimized by Kenneth's corruption, including elderly homeowners who had been forced to sell their houses after being hit with fraudulent fines they couldn't afford to fight. The county newspaper published a detailed investigation revealing that Kenneth's crimes had affected over 200 families across 3 subdivisions, with total damages exceeding $2 million in stolen funds, inflated contractor fees, and manipulated property values. Kenneth's mugshot became a statewide symbol of HOA corruption, and his name became synonymous with the kind of petty tyranny that destroyed communities and ruined lives. But the most satisfying aspect of Kenneth's destruction was watching his former allies abandon him like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Robert Chun, the nervous accountant who had rubber-stamped Kenneth's fraudulent expenditures, was arrested on conspiracy charges and immediately began cooperating with federal investigators to save his own skin. The contractors who had been paying Kenneth bribes suddenly developed amnesia about their business relationships, while the developers who had been manipulating property sales through Kenneth's HOA schemes hired expensive lawyers and started pointing fingers at each other. Kenneth's network of corruption, built on fear and greed, collapsed the moment real consequences appeared on the horizon. The final insult came when Kenneth's own homeowner's insurance company dropped his coverage after learning about his criminal activities, leaving him personally liable for the legal costs and restitution payments that would bankrupt him even if he avoided prison time. His wife filed for divorce and moved out of state, taking their children and whatever assets she could protect from federal seizure. Kenneth's country club membership was revoked, his professional licenses were suspended, and his social standing in the community evaporated as former friends and business associates scrambled to distance themselves from his toxic reputation. The man who had once ruled Meadowbrook Estates like a petty dictator was now facing life as a disgraced felon with no money, no family, and no future. The poetic justice was absolutely perfect. Kenneth had spent years using the legal system as a weapon against innocent residents, filing frivolous lawsuits and threatening criminal charges to intimidate people into compliance with his corrupt demands. Now he was experiencing the full weight of legitimate legal consequences for his actual crimes, facing federal prosecutors who had unlimited resources and no interest in his excuses or explanations. Kenneth Martinez, who had thought himself above the law, was about to learn that real justice was far more severe than any HOA fine he had ever imposed on his victims. 6 months after Kenneth's arrest, Meadowbrook Estates had been transformed from a fear-based surveillance state into the kind of community it was always supposed to be, neighbors helping neighbors without the constant threat of petty citations and fraudulent fines. The emergency HOA election held after Kenneth's criminal organization collapsed resulted in a complete overhaul of the board, with new leadership focused on transparency, fair enforcement, and actual community improvement rather than personal enrichment. The recovered stolen funds were used to complete legitimate maintenance projects that had been neglected while Kenneth was skimming money for his personal accounts, and residents finally began to trust their neighbors again after years of living under suspicion and intimidation. My toll gate had served its purpose and was quietly removed once the new HOA board agreed to respect the agricultural easement rights that protected my ranch operation from future harassment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Kenneth's anti-cattle crusade had triggered the very legal mechanism that protected livestock operations from HOA interference, ensuring that my bulls could graze peacefully without fear of vindictive citations or water sabotage. The county even designated my property as a protected agricultural zone, making any future development impossible and preserving the rural character that had attracted residents to the area in the first place. Kenneth's criminal trial became a cautionary tale that was studied by law enforcement agencies, HOA management companies, and community associations across the state. His conviction on 23 federal counts of fraud, money laundering, and corruption resulted in a 15-year prison sentence and $2.3 million in restitution payments that would keep him financially ruined for the rest of his life. The contractors and developers who had participated in Kenneth's schemes faced their own criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and professional sanctions that effectively ended their careers and served as a powerful deterrent to other would-be HOA criminals. But the most satisfying outcome was watching the community heal and rebuild stronger than ever before. Residents who had lived in fear of Kenneth's retribution began organizing neighborhood events, volunteering for legitimate community improvement projects, and actually getting to know their neighbors without worrying about surveillance or harassment. Property values recovered as the stigma of corruption was replaced by a reputation for fair governance and community spirit. The new HOA board implemented strict transparency requirements, term limits for officers, and an independent oversight committee that would prevent any future Kenneth Martinez from terrorizing residents with impunity. As I sit on my porch each evening, watching my cattle graze peacefully in the sunset, while my neighbors wave and smile as they drive past on the road that Kenneth once thought he controlled, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting criminals destroy themselves through their own greed and arrogance. Kenneth Martinez thought he was untouchable, but he learned too late that in America, property rights are sacred, agricultural protection laws have teeth, and there's always someone watching who knows how to fight back against bullies and tyrants. Have you ever had an HOA nightmare? Share your story in the comments below. And remember, subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and revenge against corrupt officials who thought they were above the law. Kenneth's case became the catalyst for sweeping HOA reform legislation that protected homeowners across Texas from similar abuse and corruption. State legislators used Kenneth's crimes as the primary example when drafting the Homeowner Protection Act, which established mandatory financial auditing requirements for HOA boards, criminal penalties for abuse of power, and an ombudsman system that allowed residents to report corruption without fear of retaliation. The law also created specific protections for agricultural properties adjacent to residential developments, ensuring that no future Kenneth Martinez could use HOA harassment to force ranchers and farmers off their ancestral land through fraudulent citations and illegal sabotage. The media attention surrounding Kenneth's downfall attracted investigators who discovered that HOA corruption was far more widespread than anyone had realized. A joint task force between the FBI and Texas Attorney General's office launched Operation Clean Slate, a statewide investigation that ultimately resulted in the arrest of 47 HOA board members, 23 contractors, and 12 developers who had been operating similar corruption schemes across multiple counties. Kenneth's case provided the roadmap for identifying the warning signs of HOA fraud, and his detailed confession during plea negotiations helped investigators understand the sophisticated methods used by corrupt officials to steal from residents and manipulate property markets. My military intelligence background proved invaluable to the broader investigation, as federal agents consulted with me on surveillance techniques, evidence-gathering methods, and digital forensics approaches that could be used to expose other corrupt HOA operations. The documentation system I had developed to track Kenneth's crimes became a template that law enforcement agencies used to train investigators in HOA fraud cases. My testimony before the state legislature helped lawmakers understand how military-style intelligence gathering could be adapted for civilian use, leading to new training programs for local law enforcement agencies dealing with public corruption cases. The economic impact of Kenneth's exposed corruption scheme rippled through the local real estate market in ways that nobody had anticipated. Property values in neighborhoods that had been targeted by Kenneth's developer cronies suddenly stabilized as the artificial manipulation was eliminated, while areas that had been undervalued due to Kenneth's intimidation tactics saw significant appreciation. The recovered stolen funds, combined with damage awards from civil lawsuits against Kenneth and his co-conspirators, provided over $3 million in compensation to residents who had been victimized by fraudulent fines and forced property sales. But perhaps the most important long-term effect was the cultural shift in how communities approached HOA governance and accountability. Kenneth's case became required reading in property management certification programs, law school courses on municipal governance, and community leadership training seminars. His spectacular downfall served as a permanent reminder that no elected official, no matter how small their jurisdiction, is above the law or immune to consequences for criminal behavior. The phrase, "pulling a Kenneth Martinez," became shorthand for any public official who abused their power for personal gain, ensuring that his name would forever be associated with corruption, arrogance, and the inevitable justice that awaits those who prey on their own communities. 2 years after Kenneth's imprisonment, my ranch had become more than just a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny. It had evolved into a thriving agricultural operation that served as a model for sustainable farming practices and community engagement. The publicity from Kenneth's case had attracted agricultural tourism visitors who came to see the famous HOA Revenge Ranch, generating additional income streams through guided tours, educational workshops, and farm-to-table experiences that connected urban residents with rural traditions. My bulls, once the targets of Kenneth's harassment, had become local celebrities whose peaceful grazing served as a daily reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of defiance can topple the most elaborate schemes of corruption and control. The relationships I had built with my neighbors during the fight against Kenneth's corruption had blossomed into genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than fear and suspicion. Former HOA victims who had been terrorized by Kenneth's arbitrary fines and vindictive enforcement now regularly visited my ranch for community barbecues, children's educational programs, and seasonal festivals that brought together people from across the county. The artificial divisions that Kenneth had fostered through his surveillance state mentality were replaced by organic connections between families who discovered they had more in common than they ever realized when they weren't living under the constant threat of petty citations. My expertise in exposing corruption had led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies, legislative committees, and community organizations dealing with similar problems in other states. The intelligence gathering techniques I had developed to document Kenneth's crimes were adapted for use in cases involving municipal corruption, corporate fraud, and organized crime operations that required sophisticated surveillance and evidence collection methods. Speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences, university criminal justice programs, and community advocacy workshops allowed me to share the lessons learned from Kenneth's case, while helping others recognize the warning signs of institutional corruption before it reached the devastating levels we had experienced. But the most personally satisfying aspect of life after Kenneth was the simple joy of operating my ranch without harassment, interference, or the constant stress of defending my property rights against frivolous attacks. My cattle could graze peacefully without fear of water sabotage. My agricultural operations could expand according to market demands rather than HOA restrictions, and my family could enjoy the rural lifestyle that had been in our lineage for generations without worrying about vindictive neighbors or corrupt officials. The easement road that had become the site of my toll gate rebellion now served as a symbol of property rights protection, with a historical marker commemorating the case that strengthened agricultural protection statewide. Kenneth's former mansion, seized by federal authorities and sold at auction to pay restitution to his victims, had been purchased by a young family who transformed it from a monument to corruption into a warm, welcoming home where children played in yards that had once been sterile showcases of Kenneth's obsessive control. The sight of that house filled with laughter and life, rather than surveillance cameras and citation threats, served as a daily reminder that communities flourish when they're built on trust and cooperation rather than fear and intimidation. Kenneth Martinez had thought he could destroy my ranch and control his neighbors indefinitely, but his legacy became the exact opposite: a stronger, more united community where property rights are respected and corruption has no place to hide. 5 years have passed since Kenneth Martinez was led away in handcuffs from that fateful HOA meeting, and his case has become a landmark example of how one person's courage to document and expose corruption can transform entire communities and protect countless future victims from similar abuse. Kenneth is currently serving his sentence in federal prison, where his requests for early parole have been denied 3 times due to his complete lack of remorse and his attempts to blame his victims for his own criminal choices. His former cronies have scattered to different states, their careers destroyed, and their reputations permanently tainted by their association with one of the most notorious HOA corruption cases in Texas history. The Homeowner Protection Act that emerged from Kenneth's case has been adopted by 12 other states and serves as a model for federal legislation currently being considered by Congress. The law's provisions for financial transparency, criminal penalties for abuse of power, and protection of agricultural rights have prevented dozens of similar corruption schemes from taking root in communities across the nation. Legal scholars study Kenneth's case as an example of how traditional criminal justice techniques can be adapted to address the unique challenges of municipal corruption, while law enforcement agencies use the investigation methods developed during his case to train officers in white-collar crime detection and evidence collection. My ranch continues to thrive as both a working agricultural operation and a symbol of successful resistance against institutional corruption. The annual Kenneth Martinez Memorial Barbecue, a community event where residents celebrate their freedom from HOA tyranny while raising money for legal defense funds that help other victims of municipal corruption, has become a regional tradition that attracts visitors from across the Southwest. The irony that Kenneth's name is now permanently associated with a celebration of justice and community spirit would undoubtedly infuriate him. But it serves as a perfect example of how legacy is determined by actions rather than intentions. The toll gate that started this entire saga has been preserved as a historical artifact in the county courthouse, complete with a plaque explaining how property rights, when properly understood and courageously defended, can protect communities from those who would abuse positions of trust for personal gain. School groups regularly visit the exhibit as part of civics education programs that teach young people about the importance of accountability, transparency, and citizen engagement in preventing corruption at all levels of government. Kenneth's case has become a cautionary tale that reminds each new generation that vigilance is the price of freedom, whether dealing with federal politicians or neighborhood HOA presidents. As I write this final chapter of our story, I'm sitting on the same porch where I planned Kenneth's downfall, watching my cattle graze peacefully in fields that are now permanently protected from development through agricultural conservation easements. My neighbors wave as they drive past on the road that Kenneth once thought he controlled, their children playing safely in yards that are no longer under surveillance, their families thriving in a community built on trust rather than fear. Kenneth Martinez thought he could use his position to destroy my ranch and control his neighbors indefinitely. But instead, he created the conditions for his own destruction while strengthening the very community bonds he had tried so hard to break. Have you ever faced a corrupt official who thought they were untouchable? Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that justice prevails and that bullies learn they're not as powerful as they think they are. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of neighborly conflict, the abuse of authority, and the strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a determined individual.